Everyone ignored Marcus, the quiet kid from a poor neighborhood with worn-out shoes and a single mother working 2 jobs. But one night, a decision he made in the rain would connect him to a billionaire and a future no one could have imagined.
Welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy powerful stories about kindness, success against all odds, and life-changing moments, make sure you hit the subscribe button, like this video, and share it with someone who needs a little inspiration today. Also, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel around the world. Now let's get back to the story of the boy everyone ignored, and the night that changed his life forever.
There are some children the world notices immediately. The ones with brand new backpacks. The ones whose parents drive them to school in shiny cars. The ones whose futures seem carefully planned from the moment they are born. And then there are children like Marcus Johnson. Children the world barely notices at all. Marcus grew up in a small apartment on the south side of Chicago, in a neighborhood where the streetlights flickered at night, and sirens were almost as common as the sound of traffic. The paint on the buildings was peeling. The sidewalks were cracked. And most families were simply trying to survive one day at a time. For Marcus, life had never been easy, but what made it harder wasn't the neighborhood. It was the feeling that he was invisible. Marcus was 12 years old. He was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of boy who preferred sitting with a book in the corner of a library rather than running around on the playground. His clothes were simple, usually the same. 2 shirts rotated every week. His sneakers were slightly worn at the soles, hand-me-downs from a neighbor whose son had outgrown them. Other kids noticed. Children can be cruel without realizing it. Sometimes they whispered. Sometimes they laughed. Marcus rarely said anything back. Instead, he simply lowered his eyes and kept walking. Not because he was weak, but because he had learned something most children his age had not. Life was already hard enough without fighting every battle. The building where Marcus lived had an elevator that only worked half the time. Most days, Marcus climbed 4 flights of stairs to reach their apartment. Inside, the space was small. A worn couch sat against the wall. A small kitchen table stood near the window, and the sound of passing traffic drifted through the thin glass at night. But to Marcus, that apartment still felt like home. Because inside those walls lived the most important person in his world, his mother. Angela Johnson. Angela Johnson was the kind of woman whose strength wasn't loud. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for help. But every day, she fought quietly for her son's future. Angela worked 2 jobs. During the day, she cleaned offices downtown, empty conference rooms and long hallways that smelled of cleaning chemicals and polished floors. At night, she stocked shelves at a grocery store across town. Most nights she returned home long after Marcus had gone to bed. But somehow, every morning, she still found the energy to wake him up for school. Sometimes Marcus would pretend to still be asleep when she came home late, not because he didn't want to see her, but because he noticed something in her face when she thought no one was watching. Exhaustion. The kind that comes from carrying the weight of an entire life on your shoulders. Despite how hard she worked, Angela always made time for one thing: talking to Marcus. One evening, as they sat at the small kitchen table eating dinner, rice, beans, and a few pieces of chicken, Marcus finally asked a question that had been sitting in his heart for years. "Mom," he said quietly, "why do some people get everything and others don't?" Angela paused. She looked at her son carefully before answering. "Marcus," she said softly, "life doesn't always start fair." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "But where you start isn't where you have to end." Marcus listened closely. Angela continued. The world might not always notice you. It might overlook you. It might even doubt you. Then she smiled gently. But kindness has a strange way of changing everything. Marcus never forgot those words. The next morning, Marcus walked to school like he did every day. 3 long blocks, past the corner store, past the bus stop, past a small park where older teenagers often gathered. Most kids hurried along those streets, but Marcus always seemed to notice things others didn't. Single quotes. An elderly neighbor struggling with grocery bags, a younger student sitting alone on a bench, a stray dog wandering the sidewalk. Marcus helped whenever he could. He carried groceries. He shared his lunch. He sat quietly beside kids who had no one else to sit with. He didn't do it for attention. In fact, most people barely noticed. But Marcus didn't mind, because his mother had taught him something powerful. Even when the world feels unfair, you can still choose to be good. One rainy afternoon, Marcus stayed late at the school library, finishing homework. The librarian eventually turned off the lights and reminded him it was time to go home. Outside, the sky had turned dark. Rain poured heavily onto the empty streets. Marcus pulled his hood over his head and began walking home through the storm. He had no umbrella, but he didn't complain. This was just another normal evening. Or so he thought, because that night, something unexpected was waiting for him just a few blocks away. Something that would change his life forever. And it all began with a strange sound coming from a car parked on a quiet street. Marcus slowed his steps. First he thought the sound was just the rain hitting the pavement, but then he heard it again, a faint knocking. Coming from inside the car. Marcus hesitated. Most people would have kept walking, but Marcus Johnson had never been the kind of boy who ignored someone in need, even if the world had ignored him. And in just a few moments, that choice would connect him to a stranger whose life and future was about to collide with his own. Marcus continued walking through the rain that evening, his footsteps echoing softly against the wet pavement. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that settles over a neighborhood after most people have already retreated indoors. Streetlights flickered above him, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. But long before that rainy night, long before the moment that would change his life forever, there was someone who had been quietly shaping Marcus into the person he was becoming. His mother, Angela Johnson. Angela had never planned for her life to be this hard. When she was younger, she had dreams just like anyone else. She imagined finishing college, starting a career, building a stable home. But life had a way of rearranging those plans. By the time Marcus was born, Angela found herself raising a child on her own, with little support and even fewer resources. There were days when everything felt overwhelming. Bills stacked up on the kitchen counter. The refrigerator sometimes held little more than a carton of eggs and a half-gallon of milk. The old car she once relied on had broken down years earlier, forcing her to take buses across the city to reach both of her jobs. Yet despite the constant struggle, Angela refused to let Marcus see defeat in her eyes. Every morning before school, she woke him up gently. "Time to get up, baby," she would say softly, pulling the curtains aside so the morning light could reach his bed. Marcus would sit up slowly, rubbing his eyes, often noticing how tired she looked even before the day had properly begun. Her work clothes still smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals from the offices she scrubbed overnight. But she always smiled. "Breakfast is ready." Sometimes breakfast was simple: toast and eggs. Sometimes just cereal. But Angela made it feel like something more important than food. It was their time together. She would sit across from him at the small kitchen table, asking about school, reminding him about homework, telling him stories about when she was younger. Angela believed something deeply. Even if she couldn't give Marcus wealth, she could still give him something far more valuable: character. Marcus, she often told him, a person's true wealth isn't in their pocket. It's in their heart. Marcus listened carefully to everything she said. He admired his mother in ways he didn't yet have the words to explain. He saw how hard she worked. He saw how she never complained. And most importantly, he saw how she treated people. Even when life was unfair to her, Angela still chose kindness. When their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, struggled to carry groceries up the stairs, Angela helped her without hesitation. When a coworker at the grocery store needed someone to cover a shift, Angela volunteered even though she was already exhausted. Marcus noticed these things. Children learn more from what they see than what they are told. And Marcus was watching. One evening, when Marcus was about 10 years old, something happened that stayed with him forever. Angela had just come home from work, later than usual. Rainwater dripped from her coat as she stepped through the apartment door. She looked more tired than Marcus had ever seen her. Marcus was sitting at the kitchen table finishing his homework. He looked up at her and asked quietly, "Mom, why do you work so much?" Angela paused. She set her bag down slowly and pulled out the chair across from him. "For you," she answered simply. Marcus frowned. "But I don't need that much stuff." Angela smiled softly. "I know, baby. I'm not working for stuff. I'm working for your future." Marcus looked confused. Angela reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. "You see this neighborhood we live in?" she said. Marcus nodded. "Some people here think this is all they'll ever be," she continued. "But that's not true. Where you start in life doesn't decide where you finish." Marcus stayed quiet, absorbing every word. Angela leaned back slightly and studied him carefully. "You're different, Marcus," she said. Marcus shook his head quickly. "No, I'm not." "Yes, you are," she replied with a soft laugh. "You care about people. I see the way you help others, the way you notice when someone is hurting." Marcus looked down at the table. "That matters," Angela continued. "Never let the world convince you that kindness is weakness." Marcus nodded slowly. "But what if people don't notice?" he asked. Angela's expression softened even more. "Then you keep being kind anyway." She leaned forward slightly. "Because the world has a strange way of rewarding the people who refuse to become bitter." Marcus thought about that for a long time. Angela stood up and walked over to the small window near the kitchen sink. Outside, the city lights flickered in the distance. "You know something else?" she said. Marcus looked up. "Sometimes," she continued, "the smallest moment, the smallest decision can change someone's life forever." Marcus didn't fully understand what she meant at the time. But he would, sooner than either of them expected. Because in just a few years, on a quiet rainy night, Marcus would face a moment exactly like the one his mother had described. A moment where he would have to decide whether to walk away or step forward. And the choice he made that night would not only change his life, it would prove that everything his mother had taught him about kindness was true. By the time Marcus Johnson turned 12, the rhythm of his life had already been shaped by the quiet struggles of the neighborhood he grew up in. Every morning began the same way. The faint glow of sunlight pushed through the thin curtains of their small apartment, the sounds of traffic drifting in from the street below, and the smell of coffee that his mother brewed before heading out to work. Marcus usually woke up before the alarm. He had learned to do that over the years. When you live in a small apartment with someone who works 2 jobs, you become sensitive to the smallest sounds, the creak of a floorboard, the turning of a door handle. The quiet sigh of someone who is already tired before the day has even begun. Angela would already be dressed, tying her hair back as she moved around the kitchen preparing a quick breakfast. "Morning, baby," she would say softly. Marcus would sit at the small kitchen table, rubbing sleep from his eyes as she placed a plate of toast and eggs in front of him. Sometimes the meals were simple. Sometimes they were even smaller than Marcus wished they could be. But Angela never allowed him to feel like they were lacking something important, because what she gave him every morning wasn't just food. It was attention. "How's school going?" she would ask. "Good," Marcus would reply. "You working on that science project you told me about?" Marcus would nod. Angela always asked questions like that, not because she had extra time, but because she wanted Marcus to know something important, that even in the middle of all her exhaustion, his future still mattered. When Marcus finished eating, he would grab his backpack and head downstairs. The walk to school took about 15 minutes. 15 minutes that revealed everything about the neighborhood he called home. He passed the same corner store every morning, where the owner sometimes waved at him through the window. He passed a park with rusted swings and faded basketball lines painted on cracked concrete. And he passed people who looked like they were carrying invisible burdens. Marcus noticed those things more than most children his age. He noticed when someone looked tired. He noticed when someone looked sad. And without realizing it, Marcus had developed a habit that would eventually define who he was. He helped people. It wasn't something he planned. It just happened. One morning, as Marcus walked towards school, he noticed Mrs. Patterson struggling near the entrance of their apartment building. Mrs. Patterson was one of the oldest residents in the building. Her back had slowly curved over the years, and climbing the stairs had become difficult for her. She held 2 grocery bags in one hand and a small purse in the other, clearly struggling to balance everything. Marcus immediately ran over. "Here, let me help you," he said, gently taking the bags from her hands. Mrs. Patterson smiled with relief. "Oh, Marcus, you're always saving me," she said warmly. Marcus shrugged as they began climbing the stairs. "It's no problem." He carried the bags all the way up to her door, setting them down carefully before heading back toward school. Moments like that didn't feel extraordinary to Marcus. They simply felt normal. Later that same day, during lunch at school, Marcus noticed something else. A boy named Eric sat alone at the far end of the cafeteria. Eric had a stutter that made it difficult for him to speak in front of others. Some kids had begun teasing him about it, laughing when he tried to answer questions in class. Marcus had seen it happen. Most students simply avoided Eric because they didn't want to become targets themselves. Marcus grabbed his lunch tray and walked straight toward him. "Hey," Marcus said casually as he sat down. Eric looked surprised. Hi," he replied nervously. Marcus began talking about a comic book he had been reading, describing the story in a way that didn't require Eric to respond much. Within a few minutes, Eric relaxed. They ate lunch together quietly. To Marcus, it wasn't a big moment. But to Eric, it meant everything. That was the thing about Marcus. He had a way of seeing people that others didn't. Where others saw awkwardness, Marcus saw loneliness. Where others saw inconvenience, Marcus saw someone who needed help. And sometimes, his kindness extended beyond people. One winter afternoon, as Marcus walked home from school, he noticed something moving near the edge of the sidewalk. It was a small dog, thin, dirty, and trembling from the cold. The dog looked frightened, its ribs visible beneath its matted fur. Marcus knelt down slowly. "It's okay," he whispered. The dog didn't run away. Marcus took off his jacket and gently wrapped it around the animal before guiding it toward a nearby animal shelter a few blocks away. The shelter worker looked surprised when Marcus arrived. "You found him?" she asked. Marcus nodded. He looked cold. The woman smiled warmly. "You've got a good heart, kid." Marcus simply shrugged. To him, kindness didn't feel heroic. It just felt necessary. But not everyone in the neighborhood shared that view. Some older kids sometimes mocked Marcus. "Look at you," one teenager once said, "always trying to be the hero." Marcus didn't respond. He simply kept walking. Angela had once told him something that stayed with him. People who make fun of kindness usually don't understand it. Marcus believed that. He also believed something else. That helping someone never made the world worse. Even if no one noticed. Even if no one thanked you. Even if the person you helped disappeared from your life the next day. Marcus continued living that way for years. Helping neighbors. Helping classmates. Helping strangers. Small moments that seemed insignificant to the rest of the world. But those small moments were quietly building something powerful inside him. They were shaping the person Marcus would become. Because kindness, when practiced often enough, becomes more than just a habit. It becomes part of who you are. And one day, Marcus Johnson would face a moment where that instinct to help someone would become far more important than anything he had ever experienced before. A moment where hesitation could cost someone their life. A moment where walking away might have been the easiest choice. But Marcus had spent years training his heart to do something else. To stop, to notice, and to help. He didn't know it yet, but very soon, all those quiet acts of kindness would lead him to a moment that would change everything. A rainy night, a quiet street, a man sitting alone in a car who desperately needed someone brave enough to stop and care. And the person who would notice him would be the same boy the world had been ignoring all along. The rain started slowly that evening. At first it was just a soft drizzle. The kind that barely makes a sound as it touches the pavement. Most people in the neighborhood didn't even notice it at first. But by the time Marcus finished his homework at the library, the drizzle had turned into something heavier. Outside the library windows, rain streaked down the glass in long silver lines, blurring the glow of the streetlights. Marcus looked up from his book when the Voring the Stiver librarian's voice gently interrupted the quiet room. "All right, everyone. We're closing in 5 minutes." Marcus nodded and carefully packed his things into his backpack. The library had become one of his favorite places over the past few years. It was warm, quiet, and filled with more stories and ideas than Marcus had ever imagined. Sometimes he stayed longer than he meant to. It felt like a place where the world was bigger than the few blocks he walked every day. But tonight, the storm outside was growing stronger. By the time Marcus stepped outside, the rain was falling steadily. Cold droplets hit the sidewalk and splashed against his sneakers. The wind pushed the rain sideways, forcing Marcus to pull the hood of his sweatshirt tightly over his head. He started the familiar walk home. The streets were unusually empty. Most people had already gone inside to escape the storm, and a few cars passing through the neighborhood drove slowly, their headlights reflecting across the wet pavement. Marcus walked quickly, trying to avoid the deeper puddles that had begun forming along the twisty curb. He passed the small park with the rusted swings. He passed the corner store where the owner had already pulled down the metal security gate for the night. Everything felt quiet. Almost too quiet. As Marcus turned onto the next block, he noticed something unusual. A car was parked along the curb near the end of the street. That wasn't strange by itself. Cars were often parked there, but this one looked different. It was a sleek black sedan, much newer and more expensive than most vehicles that passed through this part of the neighborhood. Its headlights were still on, the engine was running, and the windshield wipers were moving back and forth across the glass. Even though the car wasn't moving at all, Marcus slowed his steps. Something about it felt wrong. He kept walking, trying not to stare too much. Maybe the driver was just waiting for someone. But as Marcus got closer, he noticed something else. The car was parked slightly crooked, one of the front tires was angled awkwardly against the curb. It looked like the driver had stopped. Suddenly, Marcus hesitated as he passed the car. For a moment, he told himself to keep walking. After all, it wasn't really his business. But then he heard something. A faint sound. Marcus stopped. At first, he thought it might be the rain hitting the car. But then he heard it again. A weak, uneven knocking sound. Marcus slowly turned toward the vehicle. The sound was coming from inside. His heart started beating faster. He stepped closer to the passenger side window and tried to see through the rain-covered glass. Inside the car, a man sat in the driver's seat. He was dressed in a dark suit, the kind Marcus had only seen businessmen wear on television. But something was clearly wrong. The man's body was slumped forward over the steering wheel. His head hung low, and one of his hands twitched weakly against the door. Marcus knocked on the window. "Sir?" he called. There was no response. Marcus knocked harder. "Sir?" The man barely moved. Marcus felt panic rising in his chest. He looked up and down the street, hoping someone else might appear. But the block was empty. Rain poured harder, splashing loudly against the pavement. Marcus turned back toward the car. The man inside looked worse now. His breathing appeared slow and uneven, and his face had turned pale. Marcus tried the passenger door handle. Locked. He ran around to the driver's side. Locked. Again, Marcus's heart was racing. Had never been in a situation like this before. For a moment, fear crept into his mind. What if he did something wrong? What if he made things worse? But then he remembered something his mother had said years earlier. Sometimes the smallest decision can change someone's life forever. Marcus looked around quickly. Near the curb, he spotted a loose chunk of broken concrete. Without thinking any further, he grabbed it and rushed back to the car. He hesitated for only a second. Then, he swung the rock toward the corner of the passenger window. The glass cracked sharply. Marcus struck it again. This time the window shattered enough for him to reach through the broken opening. Rain poured into the car as Marcus unlocked the door and pulled it open. "Sir?" Marcus said urgently. The man's eyes fluttered weakly, but he couldn't speak. Marcus grabbed the man's arm and tried to shake him gently. "Sir, can you hear me?" The man's lips moved slightly, but no words came out. Marcus realized something terrifying. The man was dying. Marcus jumped back from the car and looked down the street again. Still no one. He had to get help. Now Marcus took off running. His backpack bounced against his shoulders as he sprinted down the street through the pouring rain. Water splashed around his feet with every step. His lungs burned, but he kept running. 3 blocks away, he knew there was a gas station that stayed open late. If he could reach it, someone there could call an ambulance. Marcus ran faster. Finally, the bright lights of the gas station came into view. He burst through the door, dripping wet and gasping for breath. The cashier behind the counter looked up in surprise. "Kid, what happened?" "There's a man," Marcus shouted. "He's in a car. He's not moving. I think he's dying." The cashier immediately grabbed the phone. Within minutes, the distant sound of sirens echoed through the neighborhood. Marcus ran back toward the car with the gas station clerk following behind. Red and blue lights flashed against the wet streets as the ambulance arrived. Paramedics rushed toward the vehicle. They carefully pulled the unconscious man from the car and placed him onto a stretcher. Marcus stood off to the side, soaked and shivering. Watching silently, one of the paramedics approached him. "Did you find him?" the man asked. Marcus nodded. "You might have saved this man's life," the paramedic said. Marcus looked back toward the ambulance. He didn't know the man's name. He didn't know who he was. All Marcus knew was that someone had needed help, and he had helped. As the ambulance doors closed and the sirens faded into the distance, Marcus quietly turned and began walking home through the rain. He had no idea that the man he had just saved was Daniel Whitaker, a powerful businessman whose life would soon become deeply connected to his own. And Marcus had no idea that the small decision he made that night would soon change his life forever. When Daniel Whitaker finally opened his eyes, the first thing he noticed was the brightness. The hospital lights above him glowed sharply, forcing him to squint as he tried to focus. For several seconds, everything felt distant and unfamiliar, as if his mind were still trying to catch up with his body. He could hear faint sounds around him, the steady beep of a heart monitor, the quiet footsteps of nurses moving through the hallway outside the room. Daniel blinked slowly, trying to remember what had happened. The last clear memory he had was driving through the rain. He remembered feeling lightheaded, then weak, then nothing. A doctor stepped into the room and noticed Daniel was awake. "Whoa, welcome back," the doctor said with a small smile. Daniel tried to sit up slightly, but his body felt heavy. "What happened?" he asked, his voice dry and weak. The doctor pulled a chair closer to the bed. "You experienced a severe diabetic episode while driving," the doctor explained. "Your blood sugar dropped dangerously low. If help hadn't arrived when it did, you likely wouldn't be here right now." Daniel absorbed the words slowly. Someone had helped him. "Who found me?" he asked. The doctor shook his head. "We're not exactly sure. According to the paramedics, a young boy ran into a nearby gas station asking for help. By the time they arrived, the boy had already disappeared." Daniel frowned slightly. "A boy?" "That's right," the doctor said. "From what they described, he was young. Maybe 12 or 13. Daniel stared at the ceiling for a long moment. A child had saved his life. Over the next few days, as Daniel recovered in the hospital, that thought refused to leave his mind. Daniel Whitaker was a man used to solving problems. For most of his life, if he wanted to know something, he found the answer. He had built his company from nothing into one of the most successful logistics firms in the Midwest. His business instincts were sharp, and his determination was relentless. But this was different. Someone had saved his life, and Daniel didn't even know their name. Every time a nurse entered the room, Daniel asked the same question. Did anyone find the boy? The answer was always the same. No. The paramedics had only spoken to him briefly before rushing Daniel to the hospital. The boy had been soaked from the rain and breathing hard from running, but he left before anyone could stop him. At first, Daniel assumed the boy might come forward eventually. But days passed. Then a week. Still nothing. Daniel began asking more questions. He contacted the hospital, the paramedics, even the police department that had responded that night. But the information was limited. All anyone knew was the location where the ambulance had picked Daniel up. A quiet street in a struggling part of the city. That was it. When Daniel was finally released from the hospital, most people expected him to return to his normal life. Meetings, business deals, boardrooms, and travel schedules. But something inside Daniel had shifted. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of unfinished business. One afternoon, Daniel sat in his office, looking out across the city skyline. The buildings in the distance reflected the afternoon sunlight, symbols of the success he had worked decades to build. But his thoughts weren't on business. They were on the boy. A child had seen a stranger in trouble and chosen to help. No hesitation. No expectation of reward. Just kindness. That kind of instinct fascinated Daniel, because in the world he lived in, acts like that had become rare. And so Daniel made a decision. If the boy wasn't going to come forward, he would go find him. The following weekend, Daniel returned to the neighborhood where the ambulance had found him. His driver slowed the car as they turned onto the narrow street. The area looked different in daylight. Old apartment buildings lined the sidewalks, their paint faded from years of weather and neglect. Children played basketball in a cracked parking lot nearby. A few people sat on front steps watching the afternoon pass by. Daniel stepped out of the car and looked around carefully. He tried to imagine what had happened that night. The rain, the empty street, the moment a boy had noticed a stranger in danger. Daniel walked slowly down the sidewalk. He stopped near the spot where the ambulance had picked him up. The driver of the gas station across the street noticed him looking around and approached. "You looking for something?" the man asked. Daniel nodded slightly. "Actually, yes. I'm trying to find a boy who helped me here a few weeks ago." The man thought for a moment. "Oh, yeah, I remember that night," he said. "Kid came running into the station soaked from the rain. Looked scared, but determined. Do you know who he was?" Daniel asked. The man shook his head. "No idea, but I see a lot of kids from the apartment building across the street." Daniel followed the direction of his gesture. Across the road stood an aging 4-story apartment building. The paint was peeling in several places, and the windows looked old. Daniel studied it for a moment. Somewhere inside that building, perhaps, lived the boy who had saved his life. Over the next several days, Daniel returned to the neighborhood again and again. He walked the streets. He spoke with residents. He asked shop owners and neighbors if they knew a boy who might have helped someone during the storm. Most people simply shrugged. But Daniel remained patient, because something told him that eventually he would find the boy. And then one afternoon, as Daniel walked past the apartment building once again, he saw something that made him stop. A young boy was walking up the stairs beside an elderly woman, carrying 2 heavy grocery bags for her. The boy moved carefully, making sure the woman could keep her balance. When they reached the top of the stairs, the boy set the bags down and smiled politely before heading back down. Daniel felt something click in his mind. The quiet confidence. The kindness. It felt familiar somehow. Daniel stepped forward. "Excuse me," he called out. The boy turned, and in that moment, Daniel Whitaker realized something extraordinary. The child standing in front of him was the boy who had saved his life. But what Daniel didn't realize yet was that this meeting would change far more than just his own future, because the boy standing in front of him was Marcus Johnson, and Marcus's life was about to change in ways he had never imagined. Marcus had just finished helping Mrs. Patterson carry her groceries up the narrow staircase of the apartment building when he heard a voice behind him. "Excuse me." Marcus turned slowly. Standing a few feet away was a tall man in a dark suit. His shoes were polished, and his posture carried the quiet confidence of someone used to being taken seriously. Even in the worn-down hallway of the apartment building, he looked completely out of place. Marcus immediately wondered if he had done something wrong. "Yes, sir?" Marcus said cautiously. The man studied Marcus carefully for a moment before speaking. "This might sound like a strange question," the man said, "but were you the one who ran into the gas station a few weeks ago, during that storm?" Marcus froze. For a second, he considered denying it. He wasn't used to strangers asking him questions like that. But then he remembered the night. Clearly. The rain. The car. The man inside. Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, that was me." The man exhaled quietly, almost as if a weight had just been lifted from his shoulders. "I thought it might be," he said. Marcus looked confused. "You did?" he asked. The man smiled slightly. "My name is Daniel Whitaker," he said, extending his hand. Marcus hesitated before shaking it. His handshake was small but firm. "You saved my life," Daniel continued. Marcus blinked for a moment. He wasn't sure what to say. "You were the man in the car?" Marcus asked. Daniel nodded. "I was." Marcus looked down at the floor. "I just called for help," he said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "You did much more than that," he replied. "If you hadn't stopped, if you had walked past that car like most people might have, I wouldn't be here." Marcus didn't know how to respond. He had never thought of it that way. To him, helping that night had simply felt like the right thing to do. Daniel studied Marcus for another moment. "What's your name?" he asked. "Marcus," the boy replied. "Marcus Johnson." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Well, Marcus Johnson," he said, "I've been trying to find you for weeks." Marcus looked surprised. "You have?" Daniel smiled. "You ran off before anyone could ask your name." Marcus shrugged slightly. "I had to get home," he said. "My mom worries if I'm late." Daniel's expression softened when he heard that. "Is your mother home now?" Daniel asked. Marcus hesitated. "She should be," he replied. Daniel nodded. "Would it be all right if I spoke with her?" Marcus wasn't sure why, but something about Daniel's voice felt genuine. "Okay," he said. Marcus led Daniel up the stairs to the small apartment on the 4th floor. When Marcus knocked on the door, Angela opened it a few seconds later. She looked tired. Her hair was pulled back loosely, and she was still wearing her work uniform from the grocery store. "Marcus, where have you?" She stopped when she noticed the man standing behind him. Angela immediately straightened slightly, her protective instincts kicking in. "Can I help you?" she asked carefully. Daniel stepped forward politely. "Good evening," he said. "My name is Daniel Whitaker." Angela waited. Daniel continued. "Your son helped save my life a few weeks ago." Angela frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Marcus looked at her. "It was that night when it was raining really hard," he explained. "The man in the car." Angela's eyes widened. "You never told me that." "Pard," she said. Marcus shrugged. "I didn't think it was a big deal." Daniel couldn't help but smile when he heard that. Angela looked back at Daniel. "You're telling me Marcus saved you?" "Yes," Daniel replied. "And I've spent the last few weeks trying to find him so I could thank him properly." Angela looked at Marcus with a mixture of pride and surprise. "That sounds like my son," she said quietly. Daniel glanced around the apartment briefly. It was small, but clean and organized. There were books stacked neatly on the table, and Marcus's school papers were carefully arranged near the wall. Something about the space told Daniel everything he needed to know. Marcus and his mother had built a life here through hard work and determination. Daniel turned back toward Angela. "I want you to know something," he said. Angela listened closely. "What your son did that night was extraordinary," Daniel continued. "Most people would have walked past that car." Angela placed her hand gently on Marcus's shoulder. "He's always been that way," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "I can see that." There was a short silence before Daniel spoke again. "I would like to help Marcus," he said. Angela's expression immediately tightened. "We don't take charity," she said firmly. Daniel raised his hand slightly. "I understand," he said calmly. "This isn't charity." Angela crossed her arms. "Then what is it?" Daniel looked at Marcus for a moment before answering. "Opportunity." Angela didn't respond immediately. Daniel continued. "Your son is intelligent. I can see that already. But more importantly, He has something far rarer than intelligence. Angela raised an eyebrow slightly. What's that? Daniel smiled. Character. Marcus shifted awkwardly beside them. Daniel continued, speaking carefully. I built my company from nothing. I know how hard it is to get opportunities when no one expects anything from you. Angela listened quietly. I'd like to help Marcus get access to better education, Daniel said. Mentorship, resources, the kind of support that allows someone with potential to truly succeed. Angela studied Daniel. Carefully, you don't even know. U.S., she said. Daniel nodded. That's true. They looked at Marcus. Again, but I know the kind of person your son is. Angela looked down at Marcus. For a moment. She saw the same little boy she had raised all these years. Kind, thoughtful, always helping others. She looked back at Daniel. What exactly are you offering? She asked. Daniel smiled slightly. A chance. Marcus looked between them, unsure of what was happening. Angela thought carefully. Finally, she said something simple. If Marcus wants it, we'll consider it. Daniel nodded respectfully. That's all I'm asking. As Daniel prepared to leave, he turned toward Marcus. You know, he said, that night you didn't know who I was. Marcus shook his head. No. Sir. Daniel smiled. And you helped anyway. Marcus shrugged. You needed help. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, he said. I did. As Daniel walked down the stairs of the building, he realized something important. He had come to thank the boy who saved his life, but he had just discovered something far more valuable. Marcus Johnson wasn't just a kind child. He was someone with the potential to change the world. And Daniel Whitaker had just made the decision to make sure the world finally noticed him. The first few years after Daniel Whitaker entered Marcus's life felt almost unreal. For most of Marcus's childhood, the world had been small and predictable. The apartment building, the walk to school, the corner store, and the quiet library where he spent his afternoons. But slowly, things began to change. Daniel kept his word. He didn't overwhelm Marcus with money or luxuries. Instead, he did something far more valuable. He opened doors. Marcus was enrolled in a better school across the city, one known for its strong academic programs and opportunities that Marcus had never even known existed. At first, the transition felt uncomfortable. The school buildings were larger. The classrooms were brighter. The students arrived in cars driven by parents, wearing business suits and designer clothes. Marcus still rode. The bus. His clothes were still simple. And during the first few weeks, Marcus could feel the difference between himself and the other students. Some of them spoke confidently about summer vacations and private tutors. Some carried expensive laptops and brand-name backpacks. Marcus carried the same worn backpack he had used for years, but Marcus had something. Many of those students didn't single quotes determination. He studied harder than anyone in his class. While other students complained about assignments, Marcus spent evenings reading ahead in textbooks and asking teachers extra questions. Daniel noticed every few weeks. Daniel invited Marcus to his office downtown. The building itself was massive. Tall glass windows, polished marble floors, and elevators that moved so smoothly Marcus barely felt them. The first time Marcus stepped into Daniel's office, he felt like he had entered another world. From the large windows behind Daniel's desk, the entire city skyline stretched out beneath him. You see that? Daniel said, pointing toward the horizon. Marcus nodded. That's the world, Daniel continued. And it's a lot bigger than the blocks you grew up on. Marcus listened carefully. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Success doesn't come from where you start, he said. It comes from what you do with the opportunities you're given. Marcus never forgot those meetings, but it wasn't during those business Conversations that Marcus's life took its most unexpected turn. It happened one afternoon when Marcus arrived early at Daniel's house for one of their mentorship meetings. Daniel lived in a large home on the quieter side of the city, surrounded by tall trees and wide streets that seemed far removed from the neighborhood Marcus grew up in. Marcus stepped inside and was greeted by the housekeeper, who led him into the living room to wait. The room was spacious and elegant, with large windows and shelves filled with books and photographs. Marcus wandered closer to the bookshelf, studying some of the titles. Looking for something interesting? The voice came from behind him. Marcus turned. Standing near the doorway was a young woman. She appeared to be a few years older than Marcus, perhaps in her early 20s. She had long, dark brown hair that fell loosely over her shoulders and a calm, curious expression. Marcus straightened awkwardly. "Sorry," he said. "I was just looking." She smiled. "That's okay. Most people who come here stare at the furniture." Instead, Marcus chuckled slightly. I guess books are more interesting." She stepped closer. "You must be Marcus." Marcus blinked in surprise. "You know my name?" She nodded. "My dad talks about you all the time." Marcus immediately realized who she was. "You're Daniel's daughter?" She nodded again. "Olivia." Marcus extended his hand nervously. "Nice to meet you." Olivia shook it warmly. "So, you're the one who saved my dad's life," she said. Marcus shrugged slightly. "I just helped." Olivia studied him carefully. "You know," she said, "most people wouldn't have done that." Marcus looked down briefly. "My mom says if someone needs help, you help them." Olivia smiled. "That sounds like a smart woman." Over the next few months, Marcus and Olivia began seeing each other more often. Sometimes it happened naturally when Marcus visited Daniel's house. Other times they crossed paths at events Daniel hosted for business partners and colleagues. What surprised Marcus most was how normal Olivia treated him. She didn't talk to him like he was someone who had been rescued from a difficult background. She talked to him like he was simply Marcus. They talked about books, about ideas, about the future. Marcus quickly realized Olivia was incredibly intelligent. She had studied business and social development at university and had strong opinions about how companies could create positive change in communities. One evening, as they sat on the patio outside Daniel's home watching the sunset, Olivia asked Marcus something unexpected. "Do you ever think about what you want to do with all this someday?" Marcus looked puzzled. "With what?" She gestured toward the city skyline in the distance. "The opportunities." "You getting now?" Marcus thought for a moment. Then he answered, "Honestly, I want to build something that helps people like the ones I grew up with." Olivia nodded slowly. "That makes sense." Marcus looked at her. "What about you?" Olivia smiled slightly. "I've been trying to figure that out myself." As the months passed, their friendship grew stronger. And eventually, something changed. It wasn't sudden. It was subtle. The way Olivia laughed a little longer at Marcus's jokes, the way Marcus felt strangely nervous whenever she walked into the familiar room, the way their conversations seemed to stretch for hours without either of them noticing the time. One evening, after attending a charity event together, Marcus walked Olivia back to her car. The city lights reflected softly across the street as they stood quietly for a moment. "You've changed a lot since I first met you," Olivia said. Marcus frowned slightly. "In a good way." "I hope." She smiled. "In a very good way." Marcus hesitated before speaking. "Sometimes I still feel like I don't belong in this world," he admitted. Olivia looked at him seriously. "Marcus," she said, "you belong anywhere your character takes you." Marcus felt something shift inside him when she said that. But what neither of them realized yet was that their growing connection would soon face challenges neither of them expected, because not everyone in Daniel Whitaker's world believed someone like Marcus belonged there. And the deeper Marcus stepped into that world, the more resistance he would begin to face. But one thing was already becoming clear. The quiet boy who once walked unnoticed through the streets of his neighborhood had found someone who truly saw him, and that connection would soon become one of the most important parts of his journey. For a while, everything in Marcus's life seemed to be moving in the right direction. The boy who once walked unnoticed through the streets of his neighborhood had grown into a young man with opportunity in front of him. His education was opening doors. His confidence was growing. And through Daniel's mentorship, Marcus had begun learning how the world of business truly worked. But success has a strange way of attracting something Marcus had never really experienced before: doubt. Not the quiet doubt that comes from questioning yourself. The louder kind. The kind that comes from other people. It began slowly. At first, Marcus barely noticed it. During meetings at Daniel's company, some executives looked at him with curiosity, others with polite skepticism. Marcus was younger than most people in the room, and his background was very different from theirs. He noticed the way some conversations stopped when he entered the room, the way some people avoided asking for his opinion, the way others spoke to him with a tone that suggested they didn't fully believe he belonged there. Marcus tried to ignore it. Daniel had warned him that the business world could be difficult. Not everyone will understand your story, Daniel once told him. But that doesn't mean they get to decide your future. Marcus held on to those words. Still, the whispers grew louder. At one networking event hosted by Daniel's company, Marcus overheard a conversation that made his stomach tighten. Two men stood near the bar speaking quietly. "That's him?" one of them said. "The kid Daniel picked up from that neighborhood?" The other man nodded. "Yeah, Daniel says he's brilliant." The first man chuckled slightly. Or maybe Daniel just feels guilty and wants to play hero. Marcus felt his chest tighten. For a moment, he considered confronting them. But instead, he walked away. Because deep down, Marcus knew something. The only way to silence doubt like that wasn't through arguments. It was through proof. Over the next several months, Marcus pushed himself harder than ever before. He worked late nights. He studied business strategies, market trends, and leadership techniques. He analyzed the companies Daniel admired and the ones that had failed. Marcus began developing ideas of his own. Not just ideas about making money. Ideas about solving problems. One concept in particular captured his attention. Marcus had never forgotten the neighborhood where he grew up. The broken elevators. The struggling families. The small businesses that barely survived. He realized something most people in the corporate world didn't understand. Those communities weren't lacking potential. They were lacking opportunity. Marcus began working on a project focused on creating affordable technology platforms that small neighborhood businesses could use to grow. Tools that would help local shops manage inventory. Simple systems that allowed small stores to reach customers online. It was an idea rooted in Marcus's past. And it was bold. When Marcus first presented the concept during a company strategy meeting, the room was silent for a moment. Then the questions began. Some people were curious. Others were skeptical. One executive leaned back in his chair. "That's an interesting idea," he said. "But communities like the one you're describing don't usually produce profitable markets." Marcus met his gaze calmly. "They do," Marcus replied. "People just don't invest in them." The room fell quiet again. Daniel watched the exchange carefully. He didn't interrupt. Instead, he allowed Marcus to continue presenting. Over the next 20 minutes, Marcus explained his vision. Data projections, Community impact. Long-term growth potential. By the time he finished, several people in the room looked genuinely impressed. But not everyone. One senior investor spoke up. "This sounds admirable," he said. "But are we sure Marcus is ready to lead something like this?" The comment hung in the air. Marcus knew exactly what it meant. "Are we sure he belongs here?" Daniel leaned forward. "I am," he said calmly. The room fell silent again. The meeting ended shortly after. Later that evening, Marcus stood alone in Daniel's office, looking out across the city skyline. He felt frustrated, angry, not because people doubted his idea, but because some of them doubted him before he even had a chance to prove himself. Daniel walked into the room quietly. "You heard them," Marcus said without turning. Daniel nodded. "Yes," Marcus sighed. "Maybe they're right." Daniel walked closer. "No," he said firmly. Marcus turned to face him. "They don't know your story," Daniel continued. "They don't know what you've overcome." Marcus shook his head. "But they don't have to believe in my story. They only have to believe in results." Daniel smiled slightly. "Exactly." Marcus looked back toward the skyline. For the first time in a long while, the city didn't feel intimidating. It felt like a challenge. And Marcus had never been someone who backed away from challenges. Over the next year, Marcus poured everything into building his project. He worked with small businesses, tested systems, adjusted strategies. Slowly, the platform began gaining traction. Local stores that had struggled for years started seeing growth. Customers who once overlooked those businesses began discovering them online. The idea was working. Even the executives who had doubted Marcus began acknowledging the results. But the greatest moment came during a major investor conference hosted by Daniel's company. Marcus stood on stage presenting the success of the platform. Rows of business leaders sat in the audience, listening carefully. Marcus spoke with confidence. Not the nervous confidence of someone trying to prove themselves. The quiet confidence of someone who had already done the work. When he finished, the audience erupted into applause. Later that evening, Marcus stood outside the conference hall, catching his breath. Olivia walked over to him. "You did it," she said. Marcus smiled slightly. "Not yet." She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Marcus looked toward the city skyline again. "This was never just about proving them wrong," he said. Olivia waited. Marcus continued. "It's about proving that people from places like where I grew up can build something meaningful." Olivia smiled. "I think you're doing exactly that." Marcus looked at her. For a moment, he thought about how far his life had come. From the rainy night when he saved a stranger, to standing on stages speaking about ideas that could change communities. But Marcus also knew something else. Success meant nothing if you forgot where you came from. And the next chapter of his life would be about something even bigger than proving himself. It would be about making sure other kids like him were never ignored again. Years passed. The quiet boy who once walked unnoticed through the streets of his neighborhood had grown into a man whose work was beginning to change the lives of thousands of people. Marcus Johnson's platform for small businesses had expanded far beyond what he first imagined. What started as an idea to help a few struggling shops had turned into a growing network that allowed small neighborhood businesses to compete in a world that once overlooked them. Corner stores that had been on the verge of closing were suddenly reaching new customers. Local restaurants were taking online orders for the first time. Family-owned shops that had struggled for years were finally seeing steady growth. And the most remarkable part was this. Marcus never forgot where the idea came from. Every decision he made was rooted in the same lesson his mother had taught him years ago at Their small kitchen table. Kindness. As a way of changing everything. But even as Marcus's success grew, there was something more important happening. Behind the scenes, Marcus had begun building something else. A foundation. Not the kind designed to put his name on buildings or earn headlines in newspapers, but a foundation focused on opportunity. Marcus called it the Open Door Initiative. Its purpose was simple. To give children from neighborhoods like the one he grew up in access to education, mentorship, and technology. Marcus understood something many successful people eventually forget. Talent exists everywhere. Opportunity does not. And if you give the right opportunities to the right people, incredible things can happen. One afternoon, several years later, Marcus returned to the same neighborhood where his story began. Streets looked almost the same. The apartment buildings still stood with their aging brick walls. The park still had the same cracked basketball court. But something felt different. Marcus stepped into the community center that had recently been renovated. With support from his foundation. Inside, dozens of children sat at tables filled with laptops, books, and notebooks. Some were learning coding. Others were working on school projects. Few were simply reading. Marcus stood quietly near the doorway for a moment, watching them. One young boy looked up from his computer and noticed Marcus standing there. "Are you the guy who started this place?" the boy asked. Marcus smiled. "I helped," he replied. The boy looked impressed. "Why did you do it?" Marcus thought about the question. Then he walked over and sat down beside him. "Because when I was your age," Marcus said, "someone gave me a chance." The boy leaned forward curiously. "What kind of chance?" Marcus looked around the room. "A chance to believe that my future could be bigger than the street I grew up on." Across the room, Angela Johnson sat watching quietly. Time had placed a few more lines around her eyes, but her strength remained exactly the same. She had been there for every step of Marcus's journey. The long nights studying, the moments of doubt, the victories that followed. She watched as Marcus continued talking with the children. For Angela, there was something deeply emotional about seeing her son standing in that room, because she remembered something the rest of the world never saw. The little boy sitting at their kitchen table asking why life wasn't fair. And now that same boy had grown into a man working to make life a little more fair for others. Olivia stood beside Angela, smiling. "He turned out exactly the way you raised him," Olivia said. Angela chuckled softly. "He always had it in him." Later that evening, Marcus stood on a small stage at the front of the community center. Dozens of children and parents sat in the audience. Marcus looked at them for a moment before speaking. "I grew up just a few blocks from here," he began. Some of the children looked surprised. "I know what it feels like to think the world doesn't notice you." Marcus continued. "I know what it feels like to wonder if anyone believes in you." The room grew quiet. Marcus continued. "But I also learned something important." He paused for a moment. "Sometimes all it takes to change a life is one person who refuses to walk away." Marcus thought back to that rainy night years earlier. The moment he stopped beside a car most people would have ignored. He had no idea that the man inside that car would become one of the most important people in his life, and he had no idea that one small decision would eventually lead him back to this moment, standing in front of a room full of children who were just beginning their own journeys. Marcus smiled. "The world might not always notice you right away," he said, "but that doesn't mean you aren't capable of doing something extraordinary." The audience applauded softly. After the event ended, Marcus stepped outside the community center. The evening air was calm. Across the street stood the same apartment building where he had grown up. Marcus looked at it for a long moment. So much had changed, but some things remained the same. Kindness, opportunity, and the belief that one act can ripple outward in ways no one expects. Olivia stepped beside him. "You're thinking about that night again, aren't you?" she said. Marcus nodded. Double quotes. Funny how one moment can change everything. Olivia smiled. "And you didn't even know who you were helping." Marcus looked toward the quiet street. "That's the point," he said. "Kindness isn't about knowing what you'll get in return. It's about doing the right thing, even when no one is watching." Marcus turned back toward the community center. Inside, children were still laughing and talking. New dreams were forming. New futures were beginning. And it all started with something very simple. A boy the world barely noticed, who refused to ignore someone else in need.